Hey everyone, and welcome to a new video. If you're like most photographers, you've probably been told at some point that you should take photos at the lowest ISO possible, that being ISO 100 on many cameras. In this video, I'm going to share with you why this may be the most dangerous piece of advice in photography, single-handedly responsible as the biggest reason for poor photos that I see when people ask for advice on their photos on photography forums, and that raising your ISO may be the best thing you can do for your photography. Don't forget to stay till the end where I share the pro ISO trick that allows me to get photos like this, and this. My name is Simon D'Entremont and I'm a professional nature and wildlife photographer living in Eastern Canada. I make weekly videos giving you photo tips or taking you behind the scenes for nature photography. Subscribe if you want to see more. So in this video, I'm going to show you scenarios where a low ISO isn't the right choice, show you a path not only to lose your fear, but even embrace higher ISOs. And by the way, you may be wondering, is it ISO or ISO? Actually, both are used quite commonly and both are fine, but the organization that created ISO, called the International Standards Organization, actually invented a word called ISO. So technically it's ISO, but ISO is fine. So what is ISO? Unlike the two other settings that impact the brightness of your photo, which are shutter speed and aperture, both of which physically impact how much light is reaching your sensor, ISO isn't a source of light. It's actually a gain or volume knob that the camera can adjust to brighten and darken the exposure. If your photo is going to come out too bright, the ISO can be lowered to get it just right, or raised if the photo is too dark. It's the fact that the photo is really dark in the first place that creates the noise, what is technically called a poor signal-to-noise ratio. That is, a poor ratio of good light, that is the signal, to the noise that's inherent in the sensor and electronic signals. The high ISO is revealing that your image was noisy, not creating the noise. So the noise was there before your ISO was raised to properly expose the photo. So here I shot two photos, one at ISO 12,800 and properly exposed, and the other where I've starved the sensor for light with a smaller aperture and faster shutter speed, but used ISO 1600, a much lower ISO. When I raise the underexposed photo to the same level of exposure, note that the underexposed photo is noisier than the properly exposed one, even if it was shot at a much lower ISO. If ISO caused the noise, the ISO 12,800 one would be much noisier. So what causes noisy images? Lack of light, not high ISO. Now manually setting your ISO at 25,000 will indeed make your image noisy in a way, but that's because you're telling the camera, go ahead and adjust the shutter speed and aperture so that the photo comes out really dark, because I'm going to brighten it artificially anyway. But by telling the camera to make the photo very dark, you're by default going to make it noisy with a poor signal-to-noise ratio because you're going to starve the exposure of light. So now that we understand ISO and noise, let's look at some practical applications. There are indeed times where having a low ISO is a great idea. It means that you're telling your camera to increase the shutter speed or open up that aperture to get in lots of light, because I'm not going to brighten it later. This leads to gathering a nice amount of light, leading to less noise. So if you're on a tripod and photographing a waterfall, and getting a long exposure is going to give you that nice effect of moving water, and the camera isn't moving, so getting a sharp photo isn't an issue, yes, use ISO 100. Or you're using a flash and can add light, yes, ISO 100 is great. Or product or architecture photography on a tripod, again where nothing is moving, ISO 100 is fine. But this is only a small amount of the photography that takes place in this world. Higher ISOs are a means to get properly exposed photos in other scenarios where your subjects are moving or the camera could move. Higher ISOs will allow you to have more shutter speed, freezing the action, or smaller aperture, getting more of the shot in focus. This is because raising the ISO will make the exposure brighter, which you need to balance by increasing the shutter speed, which will make it darker, or make the aperture smaller, again which will make it darker, giving it a proper exposure. In that previous scenario of shooting a waterfall, a long exposure may be great for slowing some movement of the water, but what about the leaves of nearby trees? If you've shot waterfalls before, you'll know they often create a windy environment, and the leaves of nearby trees are often moving around in the wind. If you want to freeze the action on these, you'll need more shutter speed, and for that, a higher ISO to balance your exposure. Another landscape scenario for higher ISOs is photographing waves. To freeze the action, you may need shutter speeds of 1/640th to 1/1000th of a second. Given the best situation for this is morning and evening when the sun is low, low ISO and these shutter speeds combined will likely give you very underexposed photos. Get that ISO where it needs to be to get your shot properly exposed. I've posted landscape photos before where I used ISO 800 for example, so I had enough shutter speed to freeze the leaves or waves, and some people acted like it was a cardinal sin to go over ISO 100 in a landscape shot. I've even seen people on landscape photography forums say that ISO 400 or 640 is unusable on their cameras, and putting fear into the hearts of anyone foolish enough to do that. This is simply not the case. Many modern cameras, even smaller sensor ones like micro four thirds and crop sensors, can take great photos at ISO 1600 to 3200 and full frames beyond that. I took this short-eared owl photo with a Canon 7D Mark II from 2014, that's 9 years ago, at ISO 6400. There are a few tricks to this, which I'll explain later. Another scenario where you need to embrace higher ISOs is when you're shooting handheld. To do so, you often need higher ISOs to keep the shutter speed up and to make sure your photos aren't soft from camera movement. In the midday sun, your ISO may be low, but indoors, late and early in the day, in the shade, in a dark environment, or anywhere where the light isn't generous, you'll need to raise that ISO. If you stick to a low ISO, as a hard and fast rule, there's a good chance your shutter speeds will drop so low that your images won't be sharp. In my genre of photography, wildlife, high ISOs are just part of the business. We often shoot in very low light at moving subjects, and we usually need to get those ISOs up quite a bit to get the shot. In this photo of an owl, my lens is wide open, the sun is setting over on the right, and my shutter speed is at 1/1250th of a second, about the least I can use to freeze the action for an owl taking off. That made my ISO 12,800. This photo does have some noise, but it was that or no photo. It's much easier to clean up a noisy image than a badly blurry one. And by the way, were you stuck at ISO 100 and when you finally shot at high ISOs had an aha moment where you realized it wasn't so scary? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear about it. Here are some photos I've taken, all at ISO 8000 or above, to show you that you don't need to be afraid of higher ISOs. And rather than ruin your photos, high ISOs delivered these photos to me, made them possible. By the way, speaking of wildlife photography, I'm going to Botswana next year and taking a few people with me on some 10-day workshops. You'll see some amazing sights, and I promise I'll help you get some amazing photos while you're there with all the free tips you want. I was there a few months ago and it was nothing short of epic. But if you'd rather learn these wildlife photography skills on your own, I've just launched a wildlife photography course in partnership with the Journal of Wildlife Photography with over 5 hours of video content, which you can watch on your own time. And we've got a place set up for you to post your photos of your progress and get advice from each other. Hope to see you soon, but in Botswana. You can get more information in the links below. Now, a couple of tips though about getting the best from high ISO images. First, don't crop more than you need to. Fill the frame if you can, or find compositions where you don't need to crop. That's because zooming in on your high noise photos will make the noise much worse. Get compositions that look good without cropping. Secondly, use noise reduction software to clean up your noisy images. I use Topaz products, but many other image processing software programs also have great noise reduction features. The good ones will clean up the noise in the background, yet preserve the details in your subjects. Thirdly, don't underexpose the photo to keep the ISO low and then try to brighten the exposure in processing. While some camera sensors can get away with this, called ISO invariant sensors, meaning the noise level is similar when you underexpose and raise the brightness later, for most cameras on the market today, underexposing the original exposure and raising it later in processing will just make the noise look worse. I actually own cameras with sensors that are close to ISO invariant, that being the ones on my astrophotography cameras. This is very handy because in astrophotography, exposures are often of very dim subjects that are very dark and they need to be brightened quite a bit in processing. Here's a before and after of the Heart Nebula. And I promised you a bonus tip. If you can free yourself from the shackles of overmanaging your ISO to keep it low, shoot in auto ISO. My favorite mode to shoot in is in manual with auto ISO. I set the shutter speed needed to freeze the action. I set my lens at the aperture to have the depth of field that I want, and I let the camera pick the ISO needed to properly expose my photo, which it does in hundredths of a second. ISO 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, I don't care. It may make an image quality difference, but there are no artistic differences in these choices. And here's an extra tip on using auto ISO. Some people say they don't like auto ISO because the camera chooses ISOs that are too high. No, no, no. That's like opening all the windows in a snowstorm, wearing shorts, and complaining that your fireplace can't keep your house warm enough. If the ISO on your camera hits 25,000, it's not the camera's fault. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do, balancing the exposure using the available light. If the ISO is too high, it's because we've used too high a shutter speed or too small an aperture for the available light. Keeping the ISO low is an impossible task. It's not the camera's fault, it's ours, the photographer's fault. It can't give us a low ISO if we set the shutter speed and the aperture incorrectly for the available light. If the ISO gets too high, we need to lower the shutter speed or open up the aperture or add more light like a flash or LED panel. Now, if you want to find out all about auto ISO and how to use it, watch my video on it, right here. If you thought this video was deserving, give it a like and YouTube will share it with even more photographers, helping them in their path to become the best photographers that they can be. I hope you can use this advice to go out there in your very next outing and take your own unique and amazing photos, even at higher ISOs. I know you can do it.